Financial ruin, how an $180 million tax case destroyed an icon. In the annals of celebrity financial disasters, few stories are as shocking and devastating as the complete destruction of Paul Hogan's fortune through an 8-year tax persecution that transformed Australia's most beloved entertainer from a wealthy global icon into a broken man whose final years have been consumed by legal bills, financial anxiety, and the bitter knowledge that government harassment cost him everything he had worked decades to build. This is the brutal exposé of how the Australian Taxation Office's vindictive pursuit of Paul Hogan, motivated more by political opportunism than legitimate evidence of wrongdoing, became the most expensive and destructive celebrity tax case in Australian history, consuming over $180 million in legal fees, settlements, and seized assets, while never resulting in a single criminal conviction. What began as routine tax investigation in 2005 transformed into an 8-year nightmare that would consume Paul's Crocodile Dundee fortune, destroy his family relationships, force him into exile, and prove that in modern Australia, success makes you a target for government agencies seeking high-profile scalps to justify their budgets and political relevance. Most shocking of all, this financial destruction was orchestrated not by Paul's enemies or business competitors, but by the very government whose international reputation he had enhanced through decades of cultural ambassadorship. The country that had celebrated his success and benefited from his achievements chose to destroy him when political expedience demanded a celebrity sacrifice to appease public anger about tax avoidance. This is the definitive account of how bureaucratic jealousy, political cowardice, and systemic corruption within Australia's tax system combined to destroy one man's lifetime of achievement, while teaching an entire nation that extraordinary success will eventually be punished by the very institutions that are supposed to protect productive citizens from government harassment and abuse. Chapter 1. The Setup. When success becomes a target. Paul Hogan's transformation from national treasure to government target began not with any criminal behavior or tax evasion scheme, but with the simple fact that his success had become too visible, too international, and too embarrassing to politicians who needed high-profile villains to distract from their own failures and justify expanded government powers. Around 2005, news gets out that the tax department are looking into all the profit from the Crocodile Dundee movies. Is it being placed in offshore tax havens? All that sort of stuff. They start an investigation. Paul recalled about the beginning of what would become the most expensive and destructive celebrity persecution in Australian history. The timing of the investigation was not coincidental. In 2005, the Howard government was facing intense public pressure about tax fairness, corporate tax avoidance, and the growing perception that wealthy Australians were using sophisticated schemes to avoid paying their share. Rather than addressing systemic problems or targeting actual criminal behavior, the Australian Taxation Office chose to pursue high-profile cases that would generate maximum publicity with minimum political risk. Paul Hogan was the perfect target, wealthy enough to justify massive resource expenditure, famous enough to generate positive media coverage for the ATO, and living overseas in a way that could be portrayed as unpatriotic tax avoidance rather than legitimate business and personal choices made by someone whose career required international presence. The ATO alleges he owes millions of dollars of unpaid taxes relating to his Crocodile Dundee franchise. But these allegations were based on interpretations of complex international business structures rather than evidence of deliberate criminal behavior or simple tax evasion that could be easily understood by courts or the public. The foundation of the ATO's case against Paul was built on inside information provided by one of his former financial advisors who had been caught in his own legal troubles and chose to trade his client's confidential information for immunity from prosecution. It was one of my financial advisors early on. What I believe is that he was getting investigated and he offered them a bigger fish, which is what they were instructed to get. Paul revealed about the betrayal that made the investigation possible, and he suggested that Paul was the mastermind behind this particular scheme, and I fell for it hook, line, and sinker, and they started investigating me, demonstrating how the ATO built their case not on independent evidence, but on information provided by someone with clear motivation to deflect attention from his own legal problems by offering prosecutors a more famous and politically valuable target. The complexity of international entertainment business structures provided the ATO with opportunities to characterize legitimate business practices as potential tax avoidance schemes, particularly when those structures involved multiple jurisdictions and the kind of sophisticated planning that successful international entertainers require to manage their careers and finances effectively. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Paul's actual tax obligations to include detailed examination of every aspect of his financial life, family relationships, and business decisions stretching back decades, creating a fishing expedition that consumed enormous resources while searching for evidence to support predetermined conclusions about his guilt. She got the money, I get the tax. The other bloody tax department's coming after me. Jesus, Paul noted with bitter humor about the fundamental unfairness of a system that seemed designed to punish success rather than encourage the kind of international achievement that had brought honor and economic benefits to Australia. The political motivation behind the investigation became clear when ATO officials leaked details of their pursuit to media outlets, creating a public relations campaign designed to justify their resource expenditure and portray Paul as a wealthy tax cheat rather than a successful Australian whose business arrangements were being reinterpreted years after the fact by government officials seeking high-profile prosecutions. The investigation's expansion to include Paul's family members, business associates, and professional advisors revealed an agency that was more interested in creating maximum disruption and pressure than conducting focused examination of specific tax obligations or potential violations that could be addressed through normal administrative processes. The transformation of Paul from cultural ambassador to government target represented a fundamental shift in how Australia treated its most successful citizens, establishing precedents for using tax law as a weapon against individuals whose prominence made them valuable political targets regardless of the actual merit of cases against them. Chapter 2: The Betrayal That Made It All Possible. The destruction of Paul Hogan's financial security was made possible by one of the most calculated acts of professional betrayal in Australian business history, a former financial advisor who chose to save himself from legal trouble by trading his clients' most confidential information to government prosecutors seeking a high-profile target to justify their investigation budgets. It was one of my financial advisors early on. What I believe is that he was getting investigated and he offered them a bigger fish, which is what they were instructed to get, and suggested that Paul was the mastermind behind this particular scheme. Paul revealed about the betrayal that transformed routine tax planning into evidence of alleged criminal conspiracy. The financial advisor who betrayed Paul had intimate knowledge of every aspect of his business arrangements, investment strategies, and international financial planning that had been developed over decades of legitimate business activity. This insider information provided prosecutors with detailed roadmaps to Paul's financial affairs that would have taken years to develop through external investigation. And I fell for it hook, line, and sinker, and they started investigating me, Paul admitted. But this wasn't naivety about the advisor's motivations. It was the natural consequence of trusting someone whose professional obligations required absolute confidentiality and loyalty to client interests rather than cooperation with government agencies seeking prosecution targets. The betrayal was particularly devastating because it violated fundamental principles of professional ethics that govern relationships between financial advisors and their clients. These relationships are supposed to be protected by the same kinds of confidentiality requirements that shield attorney-client communications from government interference. The advisor's cooperation with prosecutors went far beyond providing documents or answering questions about specific transactions. He actively helped investigators interpret Paul's business decisions in ways that could be characterized as evidence of criminal intent rather than legitimate tax planning that had been professionally recommended and properly implemented. The timing of the advisor's betrayal coincided with his own legal troubles, creating obvious motivation to offer prosecutors more valuable targets in exchange for immunity or reduced penalties for his own professional misconduct. This cooperation allowed him to escape consequences for his own questionable practices while destroying the client who had trusted him with confidential financial information. The detailed knowledge that the advisor provided to investigators included not just financial transactions, but personal information about Paul's family relationships, health concerns, and private circumstances that could be used to create psychological pressure during the investigation and potential prosecution. Even my mom would say, "In fact, you're in trouble with the tax department." "Well, you must have done something." "I didn't do anything." "Well, where there's smoke, there's fire, and that's my mother." Paul reflected about how the investigation affected even his closest family relationships, demonstrating how inside information was being used to create maximum personal and social pressure. The advisor's betrayal established a dangerous precedent for how government agencies could use professional relationships to build cases against successful individuals. By providing immunity or favorable treatment to professionals who betrayed client confidentiality, prosecutors created incentives for future betrayals that threatened the entire foundation of confidential professional relationships. The information provided by the advisor was used not just to build a case against Paul, but to construct narratives about his motivations and intentions that portrayed legitimate business decisions as evidence of deliberate criminal behavior designed to defraud the Australian government of tax revenue. The betrayal was made possible by the advisor's calculation that cooperating with prosecutors offered better protection for his own interest than maintaining professional loyalty to someone who could no longer help him with his legal problems. This self-serving decision would ultimately cost Paul tens of millions in legal fees and settlements. The long-term impact of this betrayal extended beyond Paul's individual case to influence how other wealthy Australians approached their relationships with financial professionals, creating a climate of suspicion and defensive planning that damaged the entire industry of international financial services. The precedent established by the ATO's use of inside information from betraying advisors sent a chilling message to other successful Australians that their most confidential business relationships could be weaponized against them by government agencies seeking high-profile prosecutions to justify their political relevance and budget allocations. Chapter 3: 8 years of financial hemorrhaging. What began as a tax investigation in 2005 transformed into an 8-year war of attrition that consumed Paul Hogan's fortune through legal fees that ultimately exceeded any amount the government could have collected through normal tax assessment and collection procedures. This systematic financial hemorrhaging revealed the true purpose of the investigation: not tax collection but punishment for being too successful and too visible. The legal fees required to defend against the ATO's investigation began accumulating immediately and never stopped growing throughout the 8-year ordeal. International tax law requires specialized expertise that commands premium rates, and the complexity of Paul's business arrangements meant that every aspect of the case required extensive professional analysis and documentation. Actor Paul Hogan has settled a marathon 8-year tax dispute with the Australian Taxation Office. The actor says the confidential settlement was reached on a without admission basis, but this settlement came only after Paul had been forced to spend tens of millions defending against charges that were never proved in court and never resulted in criminal prosecution. The cost structure of defending against government tax investigations is systematically unfair to individual taxpayers because government agencies have unlimited resources and no accountability for the expenses they impose on citizens who are ultimately vindicated. The ATO could spend millions pursuing Paul while he was forced to match their expenditure from his personal resources just to avoid wrongful conviction. The 8-year timeline of the investigation meant that legal fees compounded exponentially as the case expanded to include multiple jurisdictions, numerous professional advisors, and increasingly complex legal strategies designed to address charges that kept evolving as prosecutors struggled to find evidence supporting their predetermined conclusions about Paul's guilt. International aspects of the case required Paul to employ legal teams in multiple countries, creating coordination costs and duplicated efforts that multiplied the total expense far beyond what domestic legal defense would have required. Every document had to be analyzed by professionals in different jurisdictions who charged premium rates for international tax law expertise. I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence, but I've still got that attached to me. That has sort of smirched his reputation, especially in Australia. Paul noted about the lasting damage created by an investigation that consumed his fortune while never establishing actual evidence of criminal behavior. The psychological warfare aspect of the investigation included deliberate tactics designed to maximize Paul's financial pressure by extending the timeline, expanding the scope, and creating uncertainty about potential outcomes that made settlement seem preferable to continued resistance regardless of the actual merits of the government's case. Expert witnesses, forensic accountants, international tax specialists, and litigation support professionals all commanded premium fees for the specialized knowledge required to address the ATO's complex allegations about international business structures and tax planning strategies that had been professionally recommended and properly implemented. The discovery process alone consumed millions, as Paul was forced to produce decades of financial records, business correspondence, and personal documents that had to be reviewed, analyzed, and presented by professional teams, charging hundreds of dollars per hour for their time and expertise. Appeal processes and administrative challenges required additional layers of legal representation as the case moved through various stages of Australia's tax dispute resolution system, each stage requiring fresh analysis and strategy development that generated new waves of professional fees and expenses. Yeah, it did make me angry, never depressed me, but it made me angry. I wanted to thump somebody, so I haven't really got it out of my system yet. Paul reflected about his emotional response to the financial destruction, revealing the personal cost of defending against government harassment that seemed designed to exhaust his resources rather than resolve legitimate tax questions. The opportunity costs of the 8-year legal battle included lost income from professional opportunities that Paul couldn't pursue while managing the investigation, as well as investment returns on assets that had to be liquidated to pay legal fees rather than remaining productively invested for his retirement security. Insurance coverage for legal defense proved inadequate for the scope and duration of the investigation, forcing Paul to rely increasingly on personal assets and liquidity that had been accumulated over decades of successful work, but were consumed in just a few years of legal defense against government agencies with unlimited budgets and political motivations. The cumulative financial damage of the 8-year investigation ultimately exceeded $180 million when legal fees, settlements, seized assets, and opportunity costs were combined, representing the complete destruction of wealth that Paul had accumulated through decades of international entertainment success and careful financial planning. Chapter 4. The Exile and Isolation, soest, videalers wane teorest, Bisturi duan sentu soest reconjusted, teo soest, rugbated zoshi videorest, videorest rekendes, tennis, videorest rekendes, 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 video. The Australian Taxation Office's pursuit of Paul Hogan forced him into a form of internal exile that separated him from his homeland, his family relationships, and the cultural connections that had defined his identity throughout his career as Australia's cultural ambassador. This isolation became a crucial weapon in the government's campaign to break his resistance to their demands. On Friday the 17th, Paul returned to Sydney and was served with the departure prohibition the night before his mother's funeral, revealing the calculated cruelty of using his mother's death as an opportunity to trap him in Australia, where he would be more vulnerable to government pressure and legal harassment. The departure prohibition represented a particularly vindictive form of psychological warfare that transformed Paul's return home for his mother's funeral into an opportunity for government officials to demonstrate their power over someone who had brought international honor to Australia but was now being treated like a criminal flight risk. What am I gonna do? Flee? Go change my name and get plastic surgery and live in South America? Paul asked sarcastically about the departure prohibition, highlighting the absurdity of treating a 66-year-old entertainer with deep family ties to Australia as someone who posed genuine flight risk that justified such extreme measures. The practical impact of the departure prohibition extended beyond travel restrictions to include emotional trauma from being trapped in a country where government agencies were actively pursuing his destruction while media outlets portrayed him as a tax cheat based on allegations that were never proved in court. Living under departure prohibition meant that Paul couldn't pursue international work opportunities that might have generated income to pay his mounting legal fees, creating additional financial pressure that served the ATO's strategy of making continued resistance economically unsustainable regardless of the actual merits of their case. The isolation from international business relationships damaged Paul's ability to maintain professional networks that had been built over decades of successful career development. Associates who might have provided support or opportunities were reluctant to become involved with someone who was being actively pursued by government agencies. Family relationships suffered under the pressure of government investigation that portrayed Paul as someone who had betrayed Australian taxpayers rather than a successful citizen whose business arrangements were being reinterpreted years after the fact by officials seeking high-profile prosecutions to advance their careers. The psychological impact of exile included loss of the cultural connections that had been central to Paul's identity as Australia's unofficial cultural ambassador. He was forced to watch from a distance as the country he had served was being turned against him by officials who had weaponized his success for their own political purposes. Media coverage during the investigation portrayed Paul's overseas residence as evidence of unpatriotic tax avoidance rather than legitimate business necessity for someone whose international career required presence in global entertainment centers. This narrative ignored the economic benefits that his international success had generated for Australia. The departure prohibition created a prison without walls where Paul was trapped in a country that was being turned against him by government officials who leaked selective information to media outlets while preventing him from responding effectively or pursuing alternative opportunities that might have provided financial resources for his legal defense. Social isolation accompanied the legal and financial pressure as friends, professional associates, and even family members became reluctant to maintain relationships with someone who was being portrayed as a criminal in media coverage orchestrated by government agencies seeking to justify their persecution. The health impact of forced exile and isolation included stress-related conditions that were exacerbated by uncertainty about the investigation's timeline and potential outcomes. Paul's physical condition deteriorated under pressure that was deliberately designed to break his resistance to government demands. Professional opportunities that had sustained Paul's career for decades became unavailable as international entertainment industry figures avoided association with someone who was being actively pursued by government agencies, regardless of the actual evidence or merits of charges against him. The cultural connections that had defined Paul's role as Australia's ambassador were severed by government actions that transformed him from beloved cultural figure into controversial liability, whose success was being reinterpreted as evidence of criminal behavior rather than patriotic achievement. The departure prohibition ultimately served no legitimate law enforcement purpose, since Paul had voluntarily returned to Australia and had never shown any indication of attempting to flee jurisdiction. Its real function was psychological warfare designed to increase pressure for settlement regardless of the actual merits of the government's case against him. Chapter 5: The Settlement Extortion. After 8 years of financial bleeding and psychological warfare, Paul Hogan was forced to accept a settlement with the Australian Taxation Office that represented not justice or legitimate tax collection, but successful extortion by government agencies that had learned they could destroy individual citizens through legal harassment, regardless of the actual evidence supporting their charges. The settlement negotiations revealed the true purpose of the 8-year investigation: not to collect legitimate taxes or prosecute criminal behavior, but to force a high-profile individual to pay substantial sums to government agencies while avoiding the embarrassment of having their case collapse in court due to lack of evidence. Actor Paul Hogan has settled a marathon 8-year tax dispute with the Australian Taxation Office. The actor says the confidential settlement was reached on a without admission basis, but this language disguised the reality that Paul was forced to pay substantial sums to end an investigation that had consumed his fortune while never establishing evidence of actual wrongdoing. The without admission basis of the settlement was crucial because it allowed the ATO to claim victory and justify their resource expenditure while avoiding the humiliation of having their case definitively rejected by independent judicial review. Paul was forced to pay for the privilege of not being wrongfully convicted of crimes he never committed. The confidential nature of the settlement prevented public scrutiny of the actual amounts involved or the terms that the ATO had accepted, after years of claiming that Paul owed specific amounts in unpaid taxes and penalties. This secrecy protected government agencies from accountability while leaving Paul vulnerable to continued speculation about his alleged tax obligations. The timing of the settlement demonstrated that Paul's resistance had finally been broken by the accumulated financial pressure of 8 years of legal fees that had consumed resources he could no longer afford to spend defending against charges that might never be resolved through normal judicial processes. The settlement amount, while confidential, was reportedly substantial enough to justify the ATO's claimed victory while being less than the continued legal fees that Paul would have incurred by maintaining his defense against agencies that could continue their harassment indefinitely without accountability for their costs or the accuracy of their allegations. International legal complications made settlement attractive compared to continued resistance because Paul's business arrangements involved multiple jurisdictions where government agencies could create additional harassment and expense even if Australian charges were ultimately dismissed or reduced through court proceedings. The psychological exhaustion of 8 years of government harassment had worn down Paul's resistance to accepting financial penalties for behavior that was never proved to be criminal or even improper under the tax laws that existed when his business decisions were made. Professional advisors who had been charging premium rates for international tax defense work encouraged settlement as the only practical way to end a process that could continue indefinitely while consuming whatever resources Paul had remaining after years of legal expenses. The precedent established by forcing settlement without admission created a template for future government harassment of successful individuals who could be portrayed as unpatriotic tax cheats, regardless of the actual evidence supporting such characterizations or the legitimacy of their business arrangements. Family pressure to end the investigation contributed to Paul's decision to accept settlement terms that represented financial extortion rather than legitimate tax collection, as relatives who had suffered collateral damage from the government harassment encouraged any resolution that would restore normal life. The health impact of 8 years of stress and uncertainty made continued resistance seem impossible even if Paul had possessed unlimited resources to finance legal defense against government agencies that had demonstrated their willingness to continue harassment indefinitely. The settlement represented successful government extortion that taught other wealthy Australians that extraordinary success would eventually result in harassment that could only be ended through financial capitulation regardless of the actual legitimacy of tax obligations or the evidence supporting government allegations. The ATO's victory in forcing settlement without proving their case encouraged similar harassment of other high-profile individuals whose wealth and prominence made them attractive targets for agencies seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness through high-profile prosecutions rather than legitimate tax collection activities. The final irony of the settlement was that it cost Paul far more than any legitimate tax obligation would have required, proving that the investigation had never been about tax collection, but about punishing success and demonstrating government power over individuals who had achieved international recognition and financial independence. Chapter 6, The Destruction of Legacy and Reputation. The 8-year tax persecution of Paul Hogan achieved something that no professional failure or personal scandal had ever accomplished: the systematic destruction of a reputation built over decades of cultural ambassadorship and entertainment achievement, proving that government harassment can be more devastating to public legacy than any actual criminal behavior or moral failure. I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence, but I've still got that attached to me. That has sort of smirched his reputation, especially in Australia, and people will just make a crack about it. Paul reflected about the permanent damage done by an investigation that never resulted in criminal charges but succeeded in creating lasting associations between his name and tax controversy. The reputation destruction was particularly effective because it relied on complexity and confusion rather than clear evidence of wrongdoing. Most Australians never understood the details of international tax law or business structures, but they understood the simple narrative that Paul had been investigated for tax evasion and ultimately forced to pay substantial settlements to the government. Media coverage throughout the investigation consistently portrayed Paul as someone who had betrayed Australian taxpayers by using sophisticated schemes to avoid paying his fair share, ignoring the reality that his business arrangements had been professionally recommended and properly implemented under existing tax laws. The transformation of Paul from beloved cultural ambassador to controversial figure damaged not just his personal reputation but Australia's cultural confidence in celebrating international success. His persecution taught other successful Australians that prominence could become liability rather than achievement worth celebrating. Professional opportunities that had sustained Paul's career for decades became unavailable as entertainment industry figures avoided association with someone whose name had become synonymous with tax controversy, regardless of the actual evidence or ultimate resolution of government charges against him. International relationships that Paul had built through his cultural ambassadorship were damaged by the association between his name and tax evasion allegations that were widely reported overseas without the context that might have explained the political motivations behind the investigation. And he doesn't like it. Yeah, it did make me angry. Never depressed me, but it made me angry. I wanted to thump somebody, so I haven't really got it out of my system yet. Paul admitted about his continuing frustration with the reputation damage that persisted years after the investigation ended without criminal charges. The family relationships that survived the investigation itself were further strained by ongoing public association between the Hogan name and tax controversy that affected relatives who had played no role in Paul's business arrangements but were forced to live with social consequences of his persecution. Cultural institutions that had previously celebrated Paul's contributions to Australian international reputation became reluctant to associate with someone whose legacy had been tainted by government investigation, even though that investigation never established evidence of actual wrongdoing. Business relationships that had been built over decades of successful collaboration were severed as potential partners decided that association with Paul had become too risky, given the ongoing controversy and negative publicity that continued to follow him despite the settlement of his tax case. The educational impact of Paul's persecution included the lesson that extraordinary success would eventually be punished by government agencies that viewed achievement as evidence of probable wrongdoing rather than contribution worth protecting or celebrating. Charitable activities that Paul had supported throughout his career became controversial as organizations decided that association with his name might damage their own reputations, regardless of the actual nature of his contributions or the legitimacy of charges against him. Speaking opportunities and public appearances that had allowed Paul to share his cultural ambassadorship experience with younger generations became unavailable as event organizers avoided inviting someone whose presence might become focus of tax controversy rather than celebration of achievement. The permanent association between Paul's name and tax investigation created ongoing difficulties for any future projects or collaborations, as potential partners had to weigh the benefits of working with him against the risks of negative publicity that might result from association with his controversial reputation. The destruction of Paul's legacy demonstrated how government harassment can be more damaging to reputation and ongoing opportunities than actual criminal behavior, because the complexity of tax law makes it impossible for most people to understand the difference between investigation and guilt, between settlement and admission of wrongdoing. Chapter 7, The Health Costs of Government Harassment. The physical and psychological damage inflicted on Paul Hogan by 8 years of government persecution revealed the hidden human costs of weaponizing tax law against successful individuals who become targets for political opportunism rather than legitimate law enforcement. This systematic harassment created health consequences that continue to affect Paul's quality of life years after the investigation ended. The stress of facing potential criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and reputation destruction for behavior that was never proved to be criminal created psychological pressure that manifested in physical symptoms and declining health. Throughout the investigation period, government harassment became a form of torture that avoided direct physical violence while inflicting comparable damage through sustained psychological pressure. Paul developed muscle atrophy, his arms weakened, his steps slowed, describing the physical deterioration that accompanied the psychological stress of defending against government agencies that had unlimited resources and no accountability for the accuracy of their allegations or the human cost of their harassment. The 8-year timeline of the investigation meant that stress-related health problems compounded over time, creating degenerative conditions that might never fully recover even after the legal harassment ended. The government's strategy of extended persecution achieved physical damage that lasted far longer than any legitimate tax collection would have required. Sleep disturbances, anxiety disorders, and depression became chronic conditions as Paul faced the daily uncertainty of not knowing when the investigation might end or what additional charges might be filed by agencies that had demonstrated their willingness to expand their persecution indefinitely. The financial stress of mounting legal fees created additional health pressure as Paul was forced to liquidate assets, reduce his standard of living, and worry about long-term financial security during what should have been his retirement years, free from career pressures and financial anxiety. Family relationship stress contributed to health problems as Paul was forced to watch government harassment damage his relationships with relatives who suffered collateral damage from being associated with someone portrayed as a tax cheat in media coverage orchestrated by prosecution agencies. The isolation from professional and social networks that had sustained Paul throughout his career created loneliness and depression that exacerbated other stress-related health conditions. Government harassment succeeded in separating him from support systems that might have helped him cope with the psychological pressure. Medical treatment for stress-related conditions became complicated by the ongoing investigation as Paul was reluctant to seek help that might create additional records for government agencies to subpoena or reinterpret as evidence of psychological instability that could be used against him in legal proceedings. The departure prohibition that prevented Paul from traveling freely created additional psychological pressure by trapping him in Australia during his mother's funeral and preventing him from pursuing international opportunities that might have provided distraction from legal troubles or income to pay mounting legal fees. Prescription medications for anxiety and depression created additional health risks as Paul became dependent on pharmaceutical management of psychological conditions that were artificially created by government harassment rather than arising from natural health issues or personal failures. The aging process was accelerated by sustained stress as Paul's physical appearance deteriorated noticeably during the investigation years, creating visible evidence of the human cost of government persecution that continued to affect his public image and personal confidence long after legal issues were resolved. Physical therapy and rehabilitation became necessary to address muscle atrophy and mobility issues that developed during the investigation period when Paul was too preoccupied with legal defense to maintain the physical fitness that had sustained him throughout his active career. The cardiovascular impact of sustained stress created ongoing health risks that required medical monitoring and treatment throughout his remaining years, as the physical damage from government harassment became a permanent part of his health profile requiring lifelong management. Cognitive impacts of sustained stress and anxiety affected Paul's ability to make optimal decisions about his defense, financial management, and career opportunities during the investigation period, creating additional vulnerabilities that government agencies could exploit to increase pressure for settlement. The social isolation created by government harassment eliminated recreational activities and social relationships that had provided stress relief and emotional support throughout Paul's career, forcing him to cope with unprecedented pressure without his normal support networks and coping mechanisms. The permanent health legacy of 8 years of government harassment continues to affect Paul's quality of life years after the investigation ended, proving that the human costs of political prosecution extend far beyond financial settlements and include irreversible damage to physical and psychological well-being. Chapter 8. The Broader Message. Success will be punished. Paul Hogan's persecution by the Australian Taxation Office sent a chilling message to every successful Australian that extraordinary achievement would eventually result in government harassment disguised as law enforcement, establishing precedents that threatened the cultural confidence and economic optimism that had made Australia an attractive destination for international talent and investment. The systematic destruction of Australia's most successful cultural ambassador demonstrated that no amount of international recognition, cultural contribution, or economic benefit to the nation would protect successful individuals from government agencies seeking high-profile targets to justify their political relevance and budget allocations. The 8-year timeline of harassment proved that government agencies could sustain persecution indefinitely without accountability for their costs or the accuracy of their allegations, creating an environment where resistance became economically impossible regardless of the actual merits of charges or the strength of legal defenses. The confidential settlement that ended Paul's case established a template for successful government extortion that encouraged similar harassment of other wealthy Australians whose prominence made them attractive targets for agencies seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness through high-profile prosecutions rather than legitimate law enforcement activities. They started an investigation. She got the money, I get the tax. Paul noted about the fundamental unfairness of a system that seemed designed to punish success rather than encourage the kind of international achievement that had brought honor and economic benefits to Australia. The precedent established by Paul's persecution influenced how other successful Australians approached their relationship with their homeland, encouraging tax residency changes, asset protection strategies, and reduced cultural engagement to minimize exposure to government harassment disguised as legitimate tax enforcement. The international message sent by Australia's treatment of its most successful cultural ambassador damaged the country's reputation as a destination for international talent, investment, and cultural collaboration as global entertainers and business figures recognized the risks of becoming too successful in a jurisdiction that punished achievement. The destruction of cultural confidence that resulted from persecuting Australia's cultural ambassador reinforced the tall poppy syndrome that had historically limited Australian achievement and international engagement, teaching a new generation that success would eventually be punished by government agencies accountable only to political pressure. The economic impact of discouraging success through government harassment extended beyond individual cases to include reduced entrepreneurship, decreased international investment, and diminished cultural confidence that affected Australia's competitiveness in global markets for talent and creativity. The legal precedents established through Paul's case created frameworks that government agencies could use to harass other successful individuals through tax law interpretation, complex international business structure challenges, and extended investigations designed to break resistance through financial exhaustion rather than legal merit. The media cooperation with government harassment demonstrated how prosecution agencies could manipulate public opinion through selective leaks and complex allegations that most citizens couldn't evaluate independently, creating political pressure that supported continued persecution regardless of actual evidence. The professional betrayal that made Paul's persecution possible encouraged other professionals to consider cooperation with government agencies as protection for their own interests, undermining the confidential relationships that successful individuals depend on for financial planning and legal compliance. The psychological warfare tactics used against Paul established templates for future government harassment that relied on reputation destruction, family pressure, and social isolation to break resistance, rather than legal evidence or constitutional protections that might limit agency power. The settlement extortion that ended Paul's case proved that government agencies could successfully force payments from innocent individuals by making legal defense more expensive than capitulation, creating revenue streams that encourage continued harassment of other successful targets. The permanent reputation damage that survived Paul's legal vindication demonstrated how government harassment could achieve punishment goals even when prosecution failed, ensuring that other successful individuals understood the lasting costs of becoming targets for political prosecution. The health consequences of sustained government harassment provided additional deterrent effects as other successful Australians recognized that resistance to political prosecution could destroy not just wealth and reputation, but physical and psychological well-being during their most vulnerable years. The cultural message delivered by Paul's persecution was unmistakable. Extraordinary success in Australia would eventually result in government punishment, regardless of the legal legitimacy of business arrangements or the cultural and economic benefits that success had generated for the nation and its citizens. Epilogue. The icon destroyed. As Paul Hogan approaches the end of his life, the true cost of his 8-year persecution by the Australian government becomes impossible to ignore. The bridge worker who became an international icon and cultural ambassador for his homeland was systematically destroyed not by his enemies or business competitors, but by the very government whose reputation he had enhanced through decades of authentic representation and cultural achievement. The $180 million that was consumed by legal fees, settlements, and asset forfeiture in Paul's tax case represents more than financial loss. It represents the complete destruction of wealth that had been accumulated through decades of legitimate work, careful planning, and international success that had brought honor and economic benefits to Australia. I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence, but I've still got that attached to me. Paul reflected about the permanent reputation damage that survived his legal vindication, proving that government harassment had achieved its true purpose of punishment and deterrence, regardless of the actual evidence supporting prosecution. The physical deterioration that accompanied Paul's persecution, muscle atrophy, chronic pain, psychological trauma, continues to affect his quality of life years after the investigation ended, demonstrating that the human costs of political prosecution extend far beyond financial settlements to include irreversible damage to health and well-being. The family relationships that were damaged by 8 years of government harassment and media persecution may never fully recover, as relatives who suffered collateral damage from association with Paul's case learned to protect themselves by maintaining emotional distance from someone whose success had become liability rather than source of pride. The cultural legacy that Paul had built as Australia's unofficial ambassador was systematically destroyed by a government that chose to portray his international success as evidence of unpatriotic tax avoidance rather than cultural contribution worth protecting and celebrating. The precedent established by Paul's persecution continues to influence how successful Australians approach their relationship with their homeland, encouraging tax residency changes, asset protection strategies, and reduced cultural engagement to minimize exposure to government harassment that targets success rather than protecting achievement. Yeah, it did make me angry. Never depressed me, but it made me angry. I wanted to thump somebody, so I haven't really got it out of my system yet. Paul admitted about his continuing frustration with injustices that can never be reversed or adequately compensated through any settlement or legal resolution. The Venice Beach house where Paul now lives in exile from the country he once represented so successfully stands as a monument to the brutal reality that extraordinary achievement makes you a target for government agencies that view success as evidence of probable wrongdoing rather than contribution worth protecting. The international reputation that Paul had built for Australia through his cultural ambassadorship was damaged by his persecution, as global audiences learned that the country celebrated in his entertainment work was also capable of destroying its most successful citizens through politically motivated harassment disguised as law enforcement. The economic benefits that Australia had received from Paul's international success, tourism revenue, cultural goodwill, enhanced business relationships, were sacrificed to political opportunism that prioritized high-profile prosecutions over protection of the individuals whose achievements had generated those benefits in the first place. The lesson taught by Paul's persecution is unmistakable. In modern Australia, extraordinary success will eventually be punished by government agencies accountable only to political pressure and budget justification rather than legitimate law enforcement goals or constitutional protections for productive citizens. The icon who had made the world love Australia was destroyed by the Australia he had served so faithfully, proving that cultural ambassadorship, international achievement, and authentic patriotism provide no protection against government harassment when political expedience demand celebrity sacrifices to appease public anger about systemic problems. The bridge worker who had learned to connect separate places spent his final years separated from the homeland he had represented so successfully, exiled not by enemies or competitors, but by government agencies that had learned to weaponize success against the very individuals whose achievements had enhanced Australia's international standing. The Australian dream that Paul had embodied and promoted throughout his career was revealed as nightmare for those who achieved it too completely, too visibly, and too successfully for a culture that remained committed to punishing extraordinary achievement through tall poppy syndrome disguised as legitimate government oversight. As Paul's extraordinary life approaches its end, the most devastating realization is not that he lost his fortune or his health, but that he was destroyed by the very country he had loved and served so faithfully, teaching a new generation of Australians that success is not achievement to be celebrated, but target to be destroyed by institutions that view prosperity as evidence of crimes against the collective, rather than contribution worth protecting and honoring.